So if you're looking for a way to get a grade 9 on certain questions, then I'm going to be going through how to do a grade 9 analysis on different questions for Jekyll and Hyde. So this one is explore how Stevenson presents scientific conflict in the novella. Now, you might have something similar to this. It might be a question just purely about science or the ideas of science in society, but this sort of still stands. This is just the way that I'm phrasing this question. So conflict from science comes across through the characters of Lanyon and Jekyll. So those are the two that you want to focus on in your essay. They are really the vehicles, the devices that Stevenson is using in order to get across the idea that science is causing a conflict in society. So science was a major point of tension in Victorian society. Science made major advancements in the 19th century, and it was a time of great change. But not all scientific advancements were welcomed, and there were a lot of people who believed that this was against Christian beliefs because it was sort of in effect playing God. So the novella shows two opposing views of science. Lanyon is anatomical, which means he studies the human body. Now that's accepted. That's not necessarily playing God. It's just sort of looking at what God made and how to fix things like diseases, etc. Whereas Jekyll admits to being more interested in chemistry and transformation. So essentially that is playing God, and that's the problem that people had. Now, when you are looking for a grade 9, you want to focus on an argument. So these ideas are what's coming through in your context, but the analysis is the analysis of the two characters. So by looking at characterization and the juxtaposition of the characters, you are going to get your analysis marks. But then by looking at the ideas of science in society at the time, you're going to get your context marks. Now, there are a few quotations that I would then start to use for this. So Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in the mind. And though, of course, I continue to take an interest in him for old sake's sake, as they say, I see and have seen devilish little of the man, such unscientific balderdash. So you can zoom in on words here, that's perfectly fine. The adjective fanciful implies that he's untrustworthy, ridiculous, or very, very foolish as well, seeming like he doesn't actually know what he's talking about. It's not really the way that you would talk about a colleague that you respected. Lanyon discredits Jekyll's science, and that's reflecting the tension in the scientific community at the time, those tensions between anatomical and chemical sciences that we spoke about a second ago. Some people wanted to explore and discover, but some people were very rigid in their beliefs, and they were stuck in their ways, which is what we see in Lanyon. Jekyll is sort of portrayed as mad here. The idea of it being unscientific balderdash is another way to discredit Jekyll as a madman and see him as quite irrational, which is not what you wanted as a scientist. You wanted to be seen as incredibly rational. The other quotation I would use, I knew well that I risked death for any drug that so potently controlled and shook the very fortress of identity might, by the least scruple of an overdose or an admixture, utterly blot out that immaterial tabernacle which I looked to it to change. Now, this one is metaphorical. The word tabernacle actually means a dwelling, typically of light construction, meaning something that you can easily move. So what Jekyll is talking about is moving his identity or changing his identity in some way. But he's saying that he is willing to risk death in order to do that. So he understands that this is a very difficult thing to do, and he understands that this is a very dangerous thing to do, but Jekyll is so driven that he wants to do it. And the metaphor fortress of identity is also important, and it reflects Jekyll's interest in identity. So it's something that's been locked away for a really long time. And he admits that this is a danger. This is a scientific danger. And this dangerous thing does eventually lead to his downfall, but it also eventually leads to Lanyon's downfall. So it's an interesting one to present their conflict, their scientific conflict, because Jekyll has done something that has caused the downfall of both him and his friend due to their different scientific beliefs and also due to Jekyll's scientific ambition. Now, his own taste being rather chemical than anatomical is my last quotation, and we've already discussed this, and it highlights the difference between Jekyll and Lanyon. So Jekyll enjoys the metaphysical, so identity side of science, and aims to play God. And by that we mean changing God's creation. So God created mankind, and Jekyll is trying to change the face of mankind, to be able to separate out his personality and separate out the two people he feels like he is. Whereas Lanyon is interested in exploring the body rather than changing it. So much like medicine, for example. So if we have a look at what we would write down for this and how we would sort of start a grade 9 essay, I've written a line of argument. I think these introductions are really useful, especially if you want to get those top marks because you have a very sustained argument throughout your entire essay. So we'll start it off with, in Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson is presenting scientific conflict throughout the novella, but framing it through Utterson's perspective. Remember, Utterson is not our narrator. Hiding its significance, but heavily foreboding its link to the central conflict of the novella, Lanyon and Jekyll's narratives eventually uncover the whole mystery, showing we have been blinded to the true horrors of science throughout the novella. Stevenson thus presents how society was ignorant about scientific advancements and could not fully understand them. He questions the dangers of progress and how society and science are at odds. The characters of Jekyll and Lanyon act as foils, whose disagreement underpins the entire novella, but cannot be understood until the switch to epistolary storytelling at the end of the novella. Now, if you're not sure, epistolary storytelling is when we switch to telling the story through a series of documents. In this case, it's letters, but it could be things like diary entries, etc. The switch to epistolary storytelling at the end allows the true mystery to be unveiled, as we no longer have to frame ourselves through Utterson, a typical representation of the everyman archetype, as a normal, rational outsider who can't see how science is driving the mystery. Instead, he looks for the rational explanation of blackmail. However, this conflict has been foreshadowed throughout. This is evident through, and then I would start talking about my quotations that I started talking about before. The one thing, though, about science and scientific conflict is to keep drawing it back to that tension in society. But my overall grade 9 tips, so you are going to make sure that you are linking to a coherent argument. You're going to make sure you're looking at your examples in a lot of detail. Lots of people say, Miss, I've run out of time, or I've run out of points, things like that. And normally it's because you're not exploring the points you do have in enough detail. And make sure you connect your points together rather than writing in a point evidence explain structure, for example. So look at how the text works as a whole and how everything's coming together for a real purpose. So don't forget, like, subscribe, and comment anything you need us to go through.